Hi, welcome to part 3 of Addiction 101 for Family Members. I'm Tom Harrison, author of The Complete Family Guide to Addiction. Today we're going to be talking about why some people are susceptible to addiction and other people are not. Why is it some people can take a drink and be perfectly fine, and other people it causes their life to spiral out of control? One of the reasons that we often think addiction mistakenly is a choice is because we have the choice of stopping. So we can have a few drinks and then choose to stop. We can go to a casino and gamble and choose to stop. We can have an operation and take heavy duty painkillers and then choose to stop. So because we can choose to stop, it seems to us that, well, why can't other people? If they don't stop, they must be making a choice. What could there be about them that's different such that for them it's not a choice? How can it be different? And as to why some people are susceptible to this disease, science doesn't have a great answer. It's very complicated and it's different for different people. But one thing that scientists have found is that there are 4 things in life that correlate with susceptibility to addiction. They are risk factors, if you will, for addiction. So let's talk about those. Number 1 is genetics. There's definitely a genetic component. If you have people who have an addiction in your family, you are more likely to develop an addiction. Now, that said, there's no one simple addiction gene. It's not that easy. It's not like if you have the gene, you're going to get it. If you don't, you're out of harm's way. There are, in fact, hundreds of genetic variations, all of which in some way or another make you more or less likely to develop an addiction. And so it's very complicated. We know genetics is a factor because you can look at people, and this has been studied, people who were adopted. And if their biological parent, who they may have no memory of, had an addiction, they're more likely to get an addiction than someone who has an adoptive parent with an addiction. So nature does trump nurture, but exactly how is very complicated. Correlation or risk factor number 2 is early use. If you start drinking when you're 12, and I don't mean you raid your parents' liquor cabinet once, but you start regularly drinking when you're 12, you're much more likely to become an alcoholic than if you start when you're 19 or 20. Same if you start smoking pot when you're 14 regularly, you're going to be much more likely to have a problem than if you start later on in life. A third correlation is childhood trauma. If you have a childhood trauma, you're more likely to have an addiction. There's a fascinating study that's been done looking at thousands of people over the course of their lifetimes. They were interviewed early on about their childhood, and they were categorized in terms of having childhood traumas or adverse childhood events, ACEs or ACEs. An adverse childhood event could mean you were abused as a child, physically, sexually, emotionally, that you witnessed domestic violence, that you grew up in poverty, that a sibling or parent died or had a terrible illness when you were small. All of these are ACEs. And what the study found over time is that if you have one ACE in your background, you're more likely to develop an addiction later in life than if you have none. If you have 2, you're more likely than if you have 1. And if you have 3 or more, you are even more likely than if you have 2. So clearly childhood trauma correlates to addiction. The 4th thing that correlates to addiction is having another type of mental illness. So if you have depression or an anxiety disorder or a personality disorder or a bipolar disorder, you are more likely to develop an addiction. So we've got those 4 things. What do those 4 things have in common? We've got genetics, early use, adverse childhood experiences, and other mental illnesses. What do they have in common? And if you think back to our last talk, we talked about the pleasure and reward system in the brain. Now, the brain develops over time. Parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, are not fully developed until you're about 25. So the pleasure and reward system is being developed in your brain over time. And all four of those things have the ability to interfere with the normal development of that system. If you have a genetic situation that causes that system in the brain to not develop right, well, you can inherit that. That's a risk factor. If you early on start taking substances that mess with the dopamine production system in the brain, that can interfere with the development of the pleasure and reward system. If you have an early childhood experience that creates a trauma that makes you anxious, nervous, defensive, highly worried, and upset, that can interfere with the normal pleasure and reward system. And if you have another mental illness that causes you to have emotional reactions that may not be ideal, depression, anxiety, and so forth, that can interfere with the normal development of the pleasure and reward system. So one possibility, and we don't have a lot of data on this, but one possibility is that the person who's susceptible to addiction is the person whose pleasure and reward system isn't working all that well to begin with. And when they take a substance and they get a flood of dopamine in their brain, it's like, oh, this is how it's supposed to work. This is what I've been missing. And so people feel like their system is finally working the way it should. And this explains something that addicts say all the time. Addicts say all the time, I don't take substances to feel high. I take them to feel normal. And I think a good analogy for this is eyeglasses. Okay, I'm nearsighted. Imagine that you spent your whole life being nearsighted and you could never quite see things as well as other people. You couldn't see as well in class growing up. You couldn't see the movies as well. You couldn't drive as well. You couldn't play sports as well. You're always at a disadvantage because you're nearsighted. And one day you get glasses and all of a sudden you can see perfectly. And you say, wow, I feel normal. I feel like everyone else. I can function like everyone else. And you'd never want to take the glasses off. And for an addict, it can be like that with a substance. The first time they take that substance, they feel like, this is normal. I feel like everyone else. My brain is working the way everyone else's is. I'm getting the dopamine that I should be getting. This works. I feel normal. And so they keep taking the substance and they keep taking the substance. And the problem is that you can wear eyeglasses your whole life and they will just help you and they won't destroy your vision. But drugs of addiction are insidious. And while they may make you feel at first like you're functioning normally, they will in fact destroy the pleasure and reward system in the brain and they will destroy your life. And by the time addicts realize that, they've gotten into this cycle of craving and need, and it's very, very hard to get out of it. And that leads to all of the characteristic, terrible and self-destructive behaviors of addiction. And in our next segment, we will talk about those behaviors. So I hope you will, and how the brain influences those. So I hope you'll join me for that. Thank you.